starting. Give you a few minutes or a few seconds to get in. Seeing a lot of new faces. This is so exciting. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. We're so excited to have you here today. My name is Temi. The introduction's a little bit later, but really excited to have you all here today, where we'll be discussing the Rent Stabilization Act that we're working on through City Council, and we'll be discussing Framework 5 throughout our time together, while also talking about the AsaleSol Workgroup and kind of what got us here today. So really excited to have you all here. We have wonderful guests to discuss Framework 5 and really excited for the Q&A that will be later on in our segment. Before we dive in though, I want to discuss just some housekeeping guidelines. So closed captions are available through Zoom using the button labeled captions at the bottom of your screen. Please turn your video on if you're comfortable and able to. Please remain muted though throughout the entire event. We want to remove any type of distractions during this time. There will be, like I said, a brief Q&A at the end of the event. So please send any of the questions you may have in the chat throughout the event. We will compile them at the end for the Q&A portion. So in order to have the best view for today's event, I recommend highlighting our experts. So you can click the speaker portion, so you'll see all 4 highlighted speakers during today's event. Lastly, before we dive in, I want to do a land and labor acknowledgement. So at Urban Homeworks, we acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that European colonizers stole from the Dakota peoples indigenous to Minnesota. For this theft to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We also acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that was cultivated and developed by bodies that European colonizers stole from West African countries through the transatlantic slave trade. In order for this theft to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We acknowledge what was taken from our collective human ancestors. As we do so, we commit to work and fight for the liberation of the descendants of those enslaved through American chattel slavery and the sovereignty of all Native peoples. Thank you all. Just wanted to give a moment to reflect upon that. But really excited to dive into what we have ahead. So again, my name is Temi. I am the Equity and Engagement Director at Urban Homeworks. For those of you who don't know who Urban Homeworks is, we're a nonprofit based in North Minneapolis, focusing on housing justice. And we do that through providing affordable housing, both in our North and South Minneapolis area, as well as a little bit in St. Paul. Not only do we provide providing dignified, stable housing through our properties, but we also provide home ownership pathways opportunities through classes, down payment assistance, and things like that. Part of our work and why we're here today is that we want to advance equitable policy that truly supports our communities and partner and empower the masses to engage civically. So really excited to do that today. And I also want to pass on introductions to our guests for the evening or for the afternoon. So if you all could just share your name, pronouns, and the connection that you all have to housing. So I'll start with AsaleSol.
Thanks so much, Temi, and peace, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. My name is AsaleSol. I am the Executive Director here at Urban Homeworks, and my preferred pronouns are they or she. I'll pass it to Dr. Goetz.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edward Goetz. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, and also the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. My pronouns are he, him, and thank you all for being here. I will pass it along to Dr. Lewis.
Hello. I'm Dr. Brittany Lewis. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a senior research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, the University of Minnesota, and also owner of Research in Action. My background is in urban housing and economic development. I have had the honor of working with families and communities all across the Twin Cities and the broader region to explore questions around gentrification, eviction, and other pressing housing issues. And I'm honored to be here with you.
Wonderful. We are in such good company today, and I'm excited to dive into conversation with you all. AsaleSol, I would love if you could start off and just helping people understand what Framework 5 is, your involvement with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to take us back a little bit, even before I get into the framework, and just call us back to how we got to the place of a working group on rent stabilization within the city. Some folks, I hope many of you will remember that in our November 2021 election, we actually voted for the city to take on some form of rent stabilization. And ultimately, the city council decided that the best avenue for determining a policy was to create a working group. And so that's really how we got to this place in 2022. And so the work group was charged ultimately with creating a framework. As Temi mentioned, Framework 5 is the framework that we landed on at the end of our process, a months-long process. But ultimately, the group was really charged with protecting residents, protecting those experiencing the worst housing disparities based on race, ethnicity, and income. That was our first charge, which I think, again, is a really important reminder for our audience. In addition to that, we were being asked to hold our small landlords, large landlords accountable to fair and equitable housing practices that would prohibit excessive rent. So we were to consider how rent increases were calculated, if we wanted any exemptions or exceptions to the policy, and the impact of the policy that we created. The arrangement or the agreement of the group was that we were to reach a small majority on our vote, which is a simple majority, 51%. And so we were able to do that, and that's how Framework 5 came to be. The work group was comprised of 25 folks, and there was a mix of how those folks were identified. 6 of the members of the 25 had to be renters, and 3 of those renters had to live in our most cost burdened areas in Minneapolis. So you have North Minneapolis 55411, 55412. You also have Phillips neighborhood in South 55404. In addition to that, we had 3 property owners and 3 developers. And then 13 seats were chosen by the city itself. And majority of those 13 seats were filled by different resident organizer entities, folks that advocate for equitable housing practices. So you had organizations like Legal Aid, Homeline, the MCCD, the Metropolitan Consortium of Community Developers, the Alliance, which is a coalition of community-based organizations, Unidex por Justicia, those just to name a couple. And so that's who was at the table and came up with this framework at the end of the day. And so to dive into what we came up with, again, with our charge at the center of all of our discussions, we not only had discussions, we also had presenters like Dr. Goetz come into the space and present data to us. And so at the end of that, 51%, at least 51% of us decided that we needed rent to be fixed at 3%. and that there would be no CPI, no vacancy control or rent baking, and we'll get into those pieces a little bit later, as well as no exemptions. Now, an exemption means that a group of people or a type of structure is exempt from the policy no matter what. We decided that exceptions, were important for things like, nonprofit developers. If you were going to make significant investment in your property, those were reasons for exceptions to go before a committee to say, we need to raise our rent higher than 3%, and we're going to give evidence as to why that is an acceptable thing under this policy. When you say that something is exempt, it means that people can find their way around a policy. And so that was really important for us, is trying to figure out, again, how to protect those with the greatest racial and economic challenges in rental in our city. And then finally, the compliance and monitoring piece. So we kind of went at this at different ways. It's like we're thinking about things like city budgets. What does the city have the capacity to create and to hold people accountable to? So at the end of the day, we decided that there should be essentially like a board that looks similar to the working group, that has representation by renters, representation by owners and landlords, to make decisions on exceptions. And so we were really thoughtful in this process. And so I'm excited for us to talk about the impact that this framework will have. Thanks.
Thank you, AsaleSol. That is such helpful context to understand Framework 5 and how we got here. I'm really excited now to break it down a little bit, and I want to open it up to all of our guest speakers to speak to this. AsaleSol mentioned a little bit about the no exemptions. So I do want to open it up though to Dr. Lewis and Dr. Goetz about the 3% cap on rent increases with no exemptions, and as well, but exceptions for increases over 3% permitted in certain circumstances. So I'd love for you to speak to, like, what does this look like in practice and the impact it will have on residents?
Want to go first, Brittany? Dr. Lewis?
Go ahead, Dr. Goetz. I'll let you take the spotlight right now.
Okay, all right. So that's fine. So I think there's a couple of things to note. I think the no exemptions is an important element of the policy. I think in many cities, exemptions are given to single-family homes that are rented out, sometimes owner-occupied, duplex, triplex, exemptions sometimes for blanket exemptions, sometimes for subsidized housing, and then most commonly exemptions for newly constructed properties. And this, in most cases, severely restricts the number of units in the city that are covered by rent stabilization, and creates a kind of dual market, those that are regulated and those that aren't. And so the task force came down strongly against sort of establishing that kind of dual market, and that's an important component of the program. The exceptions, and I think AsaleSol was good to make this distinction between exemption versus an exception. The courts really require exceptions to be allowed under certain circumstances, right? That's sort of one of the standards that is applied by the courts to make sure that rent stabilization programs aren't unconstitutional takings of property. And so there has to be a system whereby a developer, a landlord, an owner can make a case for exceptional circumstances or exceptional costs, and allow that to be heard by a body in order then to exceed the rent increase cap. And so the task force also sort of responded to that kind of mandate and recommended that kind of process. So those are those are two important features of it. I will say that the type of exception that is most common around the country is an exception that is called vacancy decontrol, which means that when the renter leaves the unit, then the landlord is able to increase rents either back up as far as she or he wants or at some level above the allowed cap. And this can really thwart the overall objectives of a rent stabilization program. I think there's research of cities in the state of New Jersey, most of which incorporate this kind of vacancy decontrol. And the research shows that, the prevailing rents in those cities aren't really any different than the rents that you see in cities that don't have any rent stabilization at all. And so, I think this was another important element of the policy.
Yeah, I think Dr. Goetz summarized it well, and I feel like that last point is a place that I hope we can talk more about, and I believe will be where some of the strongest pushback lives. In short, I'd argue that many landlords and owners have been taking advantage of this current exemption, almost in some ways. From my research and experience, whether landlords are doing cash for keys, not renewing leases and forcing folks out for the purposes of being able to kick folks out, upgrade, and heavily increase rents because they know they can. I've found that to be a common practice and some of the research I've conducted around the space of eviction. And it's just a reality and that's taking place. But I also believe I would love to hear more about how the working group is thinking about the pushback it's going to receive from the landlord lobby in particular, because that has been a tactic and strategy that is actively being used and we've documented in our past work. And then I'm very curious to hear how that conversation's been going amongst the working group. And I don't know if you can think of any examples, because I don't know if I know any in this current moment that have confronted that directly, and either it has led to the court and or our city has kind of leaned in an unapologetic way against that particular exception.
Well, there are cities that have adopted the path that the task force took, right? In terms of not allowing for vacancy decontrol. So that does exist. It's not an uncommon policy choice around the country. And at the same time, I think your point about pushback is correct. These one thing you often do see around the country is sort of continual modification of the rent stabilization program over time as the politics of the city council changes, amendments are made, programs are strengthened, then sometimes they're weakened, and they're changed fairly dramatically. So I don't think anyone should consider this or whatever the city council does to be the last word on this, right? There will always be sort of response and pushback. This is the beginning of a political process not the end of one.
Thanks for that, Dr. Goetz, and appreciate that commentary from Dr. Lewis. I want to be able to get to like the other pieces of Framework 5, but AsaleSol, I would love for you to just briefly talk about what this looks like for Urban Homeworks. Like, we provide affordable housing. We are a landlord, so how Framework 5 impacts us in this work.
Yeah, that's a great question, Temi. And it's one that I think took a lot of thoughtfulness on our part going into this working group and standing in the place where we stood, which was on the side of renters. So for us, you know, we have a history as an organization of not really raising rent all that much. And so that was a big point in the discussion with the working group around the value of exceptions. You know, when you have a situation where rents are not raised, you know, we talk about dignity in our housing. And so it's really important that we're able to sustain dignity in our housing, which means that we cannot continue to not raise rents ever. But I believe that a consistent 3%, and the data shows us that a consistent 3% will allow us to maintain dignity in our properties. And so that piece of it wasn't difficult for me to decide, for the organization to stand with those residents in that. I will say that, again, to go back to the exception, you know, it was important that we talked about that dignity and sort of like this humane residence is really important, that it's vital for people to live in spaces that we all would want to live in. It's vital that we don't say, because you're low income, you have to live in squalor. And so there will be times in a situation like ours where we have delayed capital improvements because we haven't raised our rent. And this allows us to go before that, that enforcement board to say, here's our history of rent and the prices that we have persisted at, which are well below affordable housing averages, right? So these are well below 30 to 50% AMI levels. And to say like, and we need to raise rent in order to make some of these capital improvements that allow us to sustain dignity in our property. And so, you know, we were one of the only voices that was able to have that balanced perspective in the working group. But again, that's part of why we were a part of the group to begin with. I'm not sure, did that answer your question, Temi?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, AsaleSol. The next part of the framework that I want to discuss is the portion that speaks to no rent banking. Now, one I'd love to level set and open it up. If you could explain what rent banking is, and again, just be able to speak to why this is important and the practicalities and impacts this has on residents in Minneapolis. Go ahead, Dr. Goetz, you're unmuted, so I'll pass it to you first. Then I'll
so rent banking is the practice where, let's say a rent cap of 3% is enacted by the city. That means that every landlord can increase rents each year up to 3%. Some landlords, for a number of different reasons, will choose to increase rents less than 3%. All right, they may have a long-term tenant, preferred rents are what they're called, or they may have a mission like Urban Homeworks to keep rents as low as possible. Rent banking would allow the landlord to essentially bank the difference between 3% and the actual rent increase that they impose every year. And so that percentage could be banked and then claimed by the landlord at some later date, so that the landlord could then increase rents well above 3% because they had banked a couple of percentage points for several years or so. some cities allow this, but in a kind of unlimited way. Other cities allow it, but put constraints on it. For example, you can't bank for more than 10 years, or you can bank, but the maximum you can withdraw at any year is, 7, 8, or 9, or 10% or something. But I think the task force has chosen to not allow banking. The argument for banking is that some people make is that without it, landlords might be incentivized to go to the maximum amount, 3% every year, whether they want to or not, simply because they don't want to sort of lose it at some later point. That's the argument in favor of it. The argument against it is that once the landlord does sort of redeem that banked amount, that can end up to be an extremely hefty rent increase for a tenant. And there is some evidence from New York City and other places that rent banking has been used to really sort of force residents out by imposing this very large increase.
Thanks for that context, Dr. Goetz. Dr. Lewis, love to hear your perspective and thoughts of the impact that this will have for renters in Minneapolis.
Well, I mean, I fully support the working group leaning into taking a strong position and stance on rent banking. So Ed gets kind of a later point, other cities have used this, particularly landlords that have used this tactic, good, bad, or indifferent. They're either banking on the tenant being able to afford that hike and are banking on them leaving and then being able to either upgrade and increase the rent anyway. I think these tactics are well documented. And I think we should pay, real close attention to what they're teaching us around how it is both perpetuating instability and increasing houselessness. So I fully support the working group leading into this and naming this as an imperative provision. But so I think Dr. Goetz's earlier point, this is the beginning of a process. So I'd argue that leaning into these at this point, I think are very important because with different leadership, new council, these could change. So I think it's really important at this stage of the process that we're confidently leaning into restricting these elements from the outset.
If I may, Temi, I think that that's a really great point that Dr. Lewis raises, is that, we're really early in this conversation. We are still, the city council still has to review the framework, the chosen framework. And then the mayor still has to decide, and we, the voters, then get another opportunity to step in and make a decision as a city. And so, as we were coming up with this framework in particular, which we call Framework 5, we were considering all of this, considering that the road is long, considering that our primary purpose was to protect renters, to protect low-income renters, to protect predominantly BIPOC renters. And so we took the strongest stance in protecting those groups of people, recognizing that this framework, this proposal will have a lot of hands in it before it is finalized.
Thanks for that, AsaleSol. I want to jump to the next piece, and again, providing context onto what it is, as well as the impact it would have for Minneapolis renters. So part of Framework 5, there is a piece of no vacancy control. So I would love to hear just what that means, and again, the impact. AsaleSol, do you want to start this time?
Sure. I do feel like Dr. Lewis and Goetz will have greater insight into vacancy decontrol and control than I will. My biggest thing with vacancy control is that ultimately decontrol means that you're similar to things that were referenced earlier, is that you can use the gap. You can kind of push people out of housing in order to say, you know, we're going to raise rent after folks are moving out of their unit or pushed out of their unit. And so, you know, there's different tactics, again, that I think that Dr. Goetz and Dr. Lewis will have specific examples of, but that landlords can use when there is a sort of vacancy control policy that allows you to skirt something like the maximum rental increase.
Yeah, I think we have to be aware of the fact that that a provision for vacancy decontrol, where a landlord can increase rents beyond the limit when a tenant moves out, constitutes an incentive to move tenants out, right? So this is this is an incentive to evict, and so the decision that is made by the council, whether to have some form of vacancy decontrol or not, if there is some form of it, then it's really important that there be some enhanced tenant protections. Just cause evictions, anti-harassment kinds of approaches in order to address the incentive to generate resident turnover, you know, that exists if you decontrol upon vacancies. So.
Dr. Lewis, oh, you unmuted yourself. There you go.
Yep. I think just to piggyback of what Dr. Goetz and AsaleSol shared, this was a common practice that we found in our study on evictions. We documented at grave detail and length the multiple tactics that landlords were using in an informal fashion to even subvert evictions in the courts to move tenants out. We also broke down for the 90+% of folks who filed for non-payment of rent, how many were actually connected to actual non-payment of rent versus mismanagement, domestic violence, or other social economic issues that the landlords were using to push them out, which no source of eviction data had actually broken down in that way. And that required us in a qualitative fashion to both interview and document with landlords and tenants themselves to actually break down what non-payment of rent actually meant and looked like. So I think it's extremely important that there's this provision. But I'm also curious, as folks are thinking about the incentives for landlords, which provokes them to evict folks, the support that Ed gets noted around protections for tenants. And I guess I want to ask AsaleSol, in the framework 5, how much has there been conversation or space given to these protections around tenants? And I'm curious about what the kind of conversation or feel at the table about those provisions have sounded like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of thought was given. The biggest one was around just cause evictions, and you know, recognizing that the timeline that you have now, or that a renter has right now, is pretty short, and so we were really pushing for a 45-day just cause, which again we chose to lean hard again in renter protections, recognizing that, you know, likely our framework would get hacked at a bit, but ultimately recognizing that residents need time to get their their side of things together. They need time to have conversations with landlords to get clarity about the eviction. And if there's anything that can be negotiated or worked through, it's really giving that resident the opportunity to be an agent in their housing situation. In cases where, you know, it's a lawful eviction, that does not change. The 45-day does not change that. And so that was really where we were leaning hard.
I really appreciate hearing that. As I reflect on the work we did with the eviction study, as we work with Minnesota Legal Aid and other folks, we were one of the fastest eviction processes in the country, being evicted within less than 2 weeks, whereas at the time, there was on an average of 30 days hearing back about county assistance or other supports. It was also super common when interviewing tenants at housing court for tenants to say that they would agree to anything at that point, just to buy time, knowing that the intention was to push them out, and are agreeing to things that they didn't have the financial resources to actually commit to. So there's a lot of research that we've done, I think, to support the need for this 45-day just cause eviction process. And a lot of data, whether it's around the time that it takes, the lack of resources, and the responsiveness of county resources to help tap in before 30 days. So I think there's a lot of research to back up the day length in particular. And yeah, I think the strong stance is really important.
Yeah, I think that, you know, to your point, Dr. Lewis, about access to resources, we learned how quickly, once the eviction moratorium ended, how quickly people were being evicted from their properties, and they were still waiting for rental assistance. And so, you know, it's like we have all of these lived experiences. And again, lived experience was a big component for membership into this working group, right? It was like renters, folks that had explicitly experienced houselessness. And so it was really hard to ignore the impact that was having on people, especially as we're still seeing the impact of heightened evictions post the moratorium and the impact of the delay in resources on people's lives.
I appreciate this conversation, and for the audience listening, we're talking about the just cause evictions, which is actually a part of Framework 5. So it would require a 45-day notice, and again, have just cause. So not being just evicted for any reason left or right is kind of what the conversation is leaning towards right now. I want to offer opportunity. Again, Dr. Lewis, AsaleSol, even Dr. Goetz, if you have any other thoughts on just cause eviction, or else I can move forward to the final piece of Framework 5 that I'd love for us to discuss. Okay, wonderful. So the last piece that we want to talk about, and we touched on it briefly in the beginning about urban homeworks, but wanting to talk about the considerations of support to affordable housing, small landlords, and owner-occupied units, what that means and what that looks like for now the landlords in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and I'd love to just start this one if that's okay. We had in our working group small landlords. We had larger landlords represented as well, nonprofits, nonprofit developers. And so again, this 25-person work group really covered the landscape of housing, also included the Realtors Association. And we talked explicitly about each of these pieces. You know, a lot of folks said, let's just exempt affordable housing. Affordable housing already has a lot of restrictions on it. Let's not add to that. Valid point, is very valid point. But what ultimately won out was the reality that if we are trying to protect those most vulnerable in the system, we have to recognize that there are actors, affordable housing actors, that are not working within the best interest of renters, of residents, and trying to make it as difficult as possible to work around renter protection was really how this landed. We have seen, and I'm not going to call any organizations out, but we have seen folks take advantage of the label affordable housing. We have seen organizations take advantage of the label nonprofit. And so really creating something that said, you can request an exception, but you have to make an argument for it. It's not just this universal thing that keeps you out of this kind of accountability. And so I know that we have folks, we have advocates of our work that don't understand why we would be, that we would fall on the side of this, but recognizing that we are a good actor. So we are an actor in the system, that this doesn't harm us, because when we need to go apply for an exception, we can do that. And again, ultimately, this is about recognizing that some powers have the financial resources to go around policies like this, and their residents have very little resource to push back.
So I think one of the things that AsaleSol just said is really important here, and it can be applied to a number of the different dimensions of the recommendation, including the 3% cap. You hear a lot from the landlord lobby that most landlords are decent, most landlords are good, most landlords do the right thing. They are moderate in their rent increases, and so why should they be punished in this way? And the answer is this. A good rent stabilization program wouldn't be directed to those landlords, right? It's the landlords. I mean, our study showed that over the past 20 years, a 3% cap would have been higher than the median rent increase in Minneapolis for almost every single year. What it regulates is the actors at the margins of the market who are taking advantage of residents and are increasing rents, acting in irresponsible ways. And so
I'm about to dump that out. It was on.
So anyway, I would just echo what AsaleSol said.
Thank you for that. Actually, Dr. Goetz, I would love for you to take a couple minutes to even discuss now. We have Minneapolis Framework 5. With those of you who are familiar, St. Paul recently passed their own rent stabilization bill. Just wanting to hear kind of the differences in the two, and just your perspective on St. Paul's and Minneapolis, where they differ, things like that.
Sure, and I'll try to do it quickly. In the same election where the voters of Minneapolis voted in favor of allowing the city council to enact a rent stabilization, the residents of St. Paul also had a ballot initiative. But in the St. Paul initiative, it was to enact a specific program. So they put both steps into one. So the result of the St. Paul vote was actually the enactment of a rent stabilization program. And to our point earlier in the in our session today, it's already been amended. In the sense that what the voters passed was a 3% cap, which is similar to what is in Framework 5, allowance for what is called a reasonable rate of return, right? So an appeal it also did not allow any exemptions, and no vacancy decontrol, et cetera. So that's what was passed by the voters. And very early on, there were signals from City Hall that some of that was going to be changed. And so the city of St. Paul put together a task force, similar composition to the Minneapolis one. It's a larger body. And they put forward a set of recommendations. The city council then acted on those recommendations and voted for a slightly different profile. And so what St. Paul has right now is a rent stabilization program with a 3% cap, a provision for a reasonable rate of return for landlords. It has an exemption for all newly constructed units for 20 years. And it actually is retroactive. So in the very first year of the program, anything built more recently than 20 years ago is automatically exempted. It does have a provision for just cause evictions, but interestingly, it's only just cause for rent stabilized units. So if you're a landlord, there's another incentive for you to try to get around the law and have your unit defined as non-regulated. And then there is finally in the St. Paul ordinance provision for partial vacancy decontrol. So when a renter vacates a unit, the landlord can increase the rents to a level of 8% plus the rate of inflation. So, and then I guess now the last element of it is a tenant, that there is a mandatory tenant notification if the landlord is going to try to petition for an exception to the law. So those are the elements of the St. Paul. You can see some of them are similar to what the Framework 5 looks like. Some of them are similar to what the voters enacted, but it's significantly different than what the voters enacted.
Thank you for that context, Dr. Goetz. And I want to thank you all three speakers for some really good conversation. I'm going to open it up to the Q&A. So thank you all for sending in your questions. We're going to try and get to as many as we can and still honor your time so we get out at the right time. So the first question, and I'm just going to open it up, so feel free to answer it if you feel comfortable. So there is concern that while this might lower rents, but also decrease total available units, how does Framework 5 compare? What can Minneapolis do to avoid the same fate?
Well, there has been research of the city of San Francisco, which showed that because there's a exemption for new construction, you see landlords removing their rental units from the market in one way or another, either through converting to condominiums or to landlords moving into units or family members moving into units and thereby getting that exemption, or by demolishing their units, even if they rebuild new housing right on the same spot, because then that new housing will be exempt because of the new construction exemption. So the fact of the matter is that rent stabilization can lead to this kind of behavior on the part of property owners and landlords. And so there has to be some vigilance, there has to be some monitoring, and in some cases, additional regulations that limit the ability to demolish perfectly reasonable and functional housing or to convert it to condominiums. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you for that, Dr. Goetz. I'll open up to AsaleSol or Dr. Lewis, or I can go to the next question.
I just, to add to Dr. Goetz's point, I'll just say that the evidence is not consistent that rent control reduces the number of available units. And, you know, I think people are, it feels like there's a lot of fear around this kind of measure on the economics of a city. But when you look at the geographic areas that the city council really wanted this group to focus on, again, parts of North Minneapolis, Phillips in South, you see a large percentage of the population is cost burdened. And that's not just renters, that's also homeowners, which is something that people don't talk enough about. That homeowners in those areas are also cost burdened. And so a measure like this means that we are responding to the reality of the people that live in our community right now. And we're doing what we can to ensure that they are stable, that they can stay here. We're talking about families that have been here for generations that are struggling to stay here. And so I think that, again, it's like there's this fear from folks that have not experienced houselessness, fear from folks that believe that one day they could gain a lot of wealth from becoming a landlord. But it's not, the data doesn't show that you won't be able to profit as a small landlord just because we protect, again, the most vulnerable. And so I think whenever I hear things about these concerns about reducing the number of available units, I think that's why for us, we said no exemption for new development. To Dr. Goetz's point, it's like, no, like we just need you to come in and maintain the properties that we have. We need to build more of them. And we need to build more of them because we have a housing crisis.
Thank you for that. This might be our last question, but someone asked, is the Rent Stabilization Group collaborating with any Spanish-speaking organizations, coalitions, or grassroots organizations?
That's a great question. I would say that the members of the group that are in support of Framework 5, we're all doing everything that we can to educate the public on what this is about. And so I know that there are groups in support that are ensuring that the education is available in multiple languages. Unfortunately, I can't say that Urban Homeworks has done that. And so I acknowledge that, and I appreciate the question because it pushes us to translate some of this information.
Thank you, AsaleSol. Okay, I want to get to this question. We only have a couple minutes left, but I think this speaks to next steps as well. So what are the options if Mayor Frey vetoes Framework 5? Will City Council just have to compromise to find something he'll support? Can it go back on the ballot?
Yeah, I mean, the two options are getting a veto-proof majority of the city council. I don't know how possible that is, but I think the other alternative is to do essentially what St. Paul did, which was to fashion a ballot proposition or initiative that puts in front of the voters a specific program to approve or not approve.
Thank you for that, Dr. Goetz. We're at 12:59, so I want to wrap up here. But first and foremost, I really want to thank you, Dr. Goetz, and you, Dr. Lewis, for your time. And I encourage everyone listening to follow their work. They are amazing subject matter experts, as well as allies in this work. So to get educated on the work they're doing around rent stabilization. Thank you, AsaleSol, for your time. even not just today, but being part of the work group that got us to Framework 5. I encourage you all to support Urban Homeworks. We have links in the chat to donate, follow, subscribe, to stay up to date in all things Urban Homeworks and housing justice. If you are interested in supporting, which I hope you are, because we have a long road ahead and we need everyone, please, please, please contact your city council member, contact the mayor and tell them to support Framework 5. Know that we will also have other events such as this, our Housing Justice Forum coming up March 14th, just again to stay connected to all the policy that we are pushing forward as it pertains to housing justice and equity for our residents and Minneapolis and Minnesota residents at large. So again, I want to thank you so much for your time. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you all for joining and listening in.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, you all. And thank you, Temi. Great work.